Our episode today for Mysteries of Superstition Mountain is going to deal with the best organized search for the Lost Dutchman gold mine that ever took place. Not only was it the best organized, it was the best researched, it was the best financed, it was the best supplied expedition that ever took place. Our story starts in 1966. That's the same year I moved out here permanently to Arizona and bought my home. It started when an attorney contacted a private investigator named Glen Magill in Oklahoma City. He wanted Mr. Magill, who he knew was very experienced in finding missing people, to find a missing heir to an estate. And after Mr. Magill found this missing heir, the attorney invited him to a celebratory dinner. And during that dinner, the attorney told Mr. Magill the story of the Lost Dutchman legend. Magill wasn't all that interested in it because he thought, looking for something like that might take years. But the attorney offered to finance his first expedition and promised to send him all the documentation that he had on hand. Well, Glenn had a job come up that took him to Phoenix. So while he was visiting Phoenix, he went through all the newspaper archives and he went down to some of the libraries and looked up a bunch of stuff on Jacob Waltz and any of the names that were involved and done a tremendous amount of research. He ran across 2 books. One was by Barry Storm, which was the book that was used to make Lust for Gold movie, and Sims Ely's book, The Lost Dutchman Gold Mine. And in those books, he saw all the same clues that we've been talking about. In the newspapers, the same stories that we've been talking about all this time. But he did one thing that nobody else had ever done. He had seen the clue of the imaginary 5-mile circle. The center of was Weaver's Needles, so he rented a helicopter. And he knew about, from the books, he knew about Canyon Fresco that nobody had ever found. And he flew this 5-mile circle, and on one of his last flights that went directly towards Weaver's Needle, they went over the top of Bluff Springs Mountain, and there he saw what everybody today now knows is Canyon Fresco. So with that information, he went back home and organized in Oklahoma City and organized 5 guys that he had trust in to go on this search. He bought all the equipment, all the food, every man was purchased a rifle for every man and plenty of ammunition. Because these early 60s was the feud between Ed Piper and Celeste Marie Jones, where some people had been killed. And he wasn't about to go out there under these circumstances without being heavily armed. He bought 2 pack mules and they loaded them in a truck, and another car followed behind, and they all came out to Apache Junction and headquarters out of the Superstition Inn. They went into the mountains and following from Peralta Road, following the exact clues of the North Trending Canyon and all the clues that we've talked about, and into the tributary canyon, and ended up in Needle Canyon. This is between Blacktop Mesa and Bluff Springs Mountain. So they decided to go up on Blacktop Mesa, and using binoculars, they searched the whole west wall of Bluff Springs Mountain looking for a cave, because this is what they were supposed to find. And they couldn't see a thing. There's no vegetation to speak of on the cliffs of Bluff Springs Mountain. So they went on down the side of Blacktop Mesa where Adolph Ruth's body was found. And by the way, I need to back up a little bit there because he also contacted Adolph Ruth's son. He tracked him down and gave him a phone call because he explained to his son that he thought that Adolph wouldn't have took the original maps into the Superstitions. He would probably have taken copies, and perhaps some member of the family might have the originals. So he explained this to Mr. Ruth, and Ruth stated that no, Dad took the original in with him, and not only took that original, he took 2 other maps in with him too. And he promised to send him the maps. And this is what really got Mr. Magill so excited about doing this expedition. So now we're back in Needle Canyon, and using the Ruth Gonzalez profile map, he found the face that looked like a man and the pillars that they were talking about. So when Magill and his group found the rock face that matched the profile map, it wasn't right. There was something absolutely wrong with the whole thing. Then he remembered what Erwin Ruth mentioned something about having to reverse the map. So he reversed the map, and it matched exactly what was on the profile map. And they were at the bottom of Bluff Springs Mountain, and one of the guys started up the cliff ahead of the rest of them. And he was scaling pretty good and lost his grip and had a bad fall. He didn't hurt himself, but he fell out of sight. And the rest of the guys were rushing to find him. And when they got there, they were actually looking past him because there was the cave that they couldn't find with binoculars. But it was a big cave. It wasn't a tunnel like the clues said. A tunnel in the side of the mountain with a funnel pit on top of the mountain over the tunnel. It was a huge tunnel, about 30 feet high. But one of the guys went into the cave and found that in the back of the cave, there was a tunnel that had been bored into the mountain. Since they found the tunnel in the back of the cave, they were now assured that the pit mine was going to be found on top of the cliffs. But even though Mr. Magill had flown the Superstitions in a helicopter and found Canyon de Fresca and knew about Bluff Springs Mountain, he didn't know of a way to get up on the top because it was sheer cliffs. So he decided to rent a helicopter, and this helicopter was just a 2-seater. It could only take one guy at a time and very small amount of supplies, and it was $75 an hour to use this helicopter, and it was very expensive getting the whole group up on top of Bluff Springs and all the equipment. They didn't know about the way that we all go up on Bluff Springs from the southeast corner, or the trail that is precarious that is on the north side. Anyway, they established their base camp on a flat place up on top of Bluff Springs Mountain. And we have a map here that Mr. Magill drew himself of their operation up there that you can look at. And then they began to make the trek along the whole west face of Bluff Springs Mountains towards the south end, where they hoped to find this funnel pit. Well, it took them several hours to negotiate the entire length of the Bluff Springs, but when they got to the end, Mr. Magill tripped at the very end and almost fell in the pit, and there it was. And they were just absolutely elated and were absolutely certain that they had really found the Lost Dutchman gold mine. So their next step was to go back to Oklahoma City. They left the place unguarded and swore everybody to secrecy, and went back and to organize. They formed a corporation. They made up contracts for people's shares and all this kind of stuff. And a day or two after they got home, they got a phone call from a reporter. One of the guy's wives had talked to her sister who was a proofreader at the newspaper in Oklahoma City. And she had spilled the beans to a reporter. And this reporter wanted all the information about the Lost Dutchman gold mine. Well, they were flabbergasted that the word had got out, that the cat was out of the bag, and they tried to convince this guy that it was just absolutely too early to put any story out about it because you'd have the mountains flooded with people now trying to find what they'd already found. So they made a deal with the guy to hold the story, and he would be allowed to have what's the word?
Exclusive.
An exclusive on this whole thing. And he agreed. But the next day, the story was in the paper, and it was bad. And it turned out that the reporter had got a hold of Erwin Ruth, Adolph Ruth's son, and Mr. Ruth made a statement that, well, if they used my dad's map and found this, then they must have found the Lost Dutchman gold mine. Well, the phone began ringing off the hooks now. And but one of the calls was from a fellow in Arizona who agreed to finance the whole operation. And of course, for a share. And they really didn't have any alternative. So they decided to do this. And they got all their act together and made another trip out to Arizona, into the mountains, and started working on cleaning out the pit. Only 2 guys could actually work on the pit. And they got down about 12 feet, and it seemed like there was a layer of cement. It was very difficult to do anything with it. But they kept chipping away at it, and Magill took a sample of it and sent it off to be analyzed. And it wasn't cement, it was some kind of a natural formation. And they managed to get through it and got down another foot and run into another layer of it, and they got into that and managed to get that open. Meanwhile, some guys were working on the tunnel, and they come upon a wall of the same kind of stuff that looked like a door. And they just kept working at this till, and Magill was in and out of the mountains back to Oklahoma City and stuff like that while all this was going on. And finally a phone call came to Glen that they had broken through the last layer of this stuff and came across some wooden logs that were across the bottom. And they took up the logs, and they were hand-hewn, and the guy that made the call reported that, well, we found the vein, but it was worked out. Tom Collenborn and I, as co-founders of the museum, we had been on Bluff Springs Mountain a time or two. One time we went up to look for a 18-inch opening that his dad had found many years ago. And if you look at Glen Magill's map, clear over on the east end of Bluff Springs Mountain, you'll find a notation where it says Cave of the Lost Sandals. Well, the Lost Sandals was not what we were looking for, but it was an 18-inch opening that I read, that Tom allowed me to read in his dad's diary, that he found and went in, and it opened up into a larger chamber, then narrowed down again and opened up into a much larger cave. And in there he found a couple of really old trunks. And he didn't tell his buddies about it because his statement was they'd just take it out and put it on their mantle. So he just left all of it in there. Well, Tom and I searched for this tunnel, but this little opening, but we never did find it. So Tom and I decided that we would go over and try to find that pit. And in this book, Killer Mountain, they had taken a photograph of the pit looking down the valley into Needle Canyon. And we got on Google Earth and was able to duplicate where they were standing when that picture was taken. So we went back up on Bluff Springs Mountain probably the 3rd time, specifically to try to find this pit. And we worked our way over. This Bluff Springs Mountain is quite a large mountain, and we were coming up from the southeast corner to the northwest corner, and then clear over to the south end. It was an all-day trip, and when we got to the point, we were able to stand right exactly where our picture that we had taken from off Google Earth where the pit should have been. But actually there was nothing there. Then I remembered in the book, when Glen Magill went back in there after they found nothing at the bottom of the pit, that they had went over to visit it one more time, and it was completely filled up, and somebody had found their stash of dynamite and set their dynamite off and caused it enough of a landslide to fill the whole pit. So we were standing in the area, but obviously we didn't find it. But that was an interesting trip too, because that's the trip where I mentioned in one of our stories that there was some dynamiting going on someplace else in the Superstitions. And Tom thought it was Crazy Jake, and we met Crazy Jake that night in the bar and had a little go around with him. But also on that trip, Tom wanted to show me the Spanish rings. Not very far from where the pit was supposed to be, spikes had been driven into the wall. There was at least 4 of them that I remember, might have been 5 or 6. And these spikes had rings on them. And this is supposedly where the Spaniards were supposed to have tethered their animals while they were working. But Tom later revealed to me that he knew that it was cowboys that put those up there, because Bluff Springs Mountain, cattle often went up to the top of Bluff Springs Mountain because there was a lot of grass up there, there was water up there, and the cowboys sometimes spent the night up there and tethered their animals to the rings they drove in the wall. You know, this book that I'm talking about was called Killer Mountain. And it was very well written, and it's riveting to read it. And only somebody that knows a lot about the legend would know where the mistakes were made in some of the clues and stuff like that. But it's worth the read, even though it came to nothing. But Glen Magill was back in the mountains several times after that. The last date I remember was 1973. He was still back in there. And when we got our tax exempt status in 1980, Tom Collenborn had contacted Mr. Magill, and Mr. Magill was in our first journal as an honorary board member of the Superstition Mountain Historical Society. Anyway, as it all come to nothing, thousands of people are still looking. And it's just another mystery of the Superstition Mountain.
Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.